I'd like to begin by welcoming you all, and I'm grateful that you're here. We're not as glamorous as you, Grant, next door, but we're far better looking. We're certainly going to be far more coherent than any of those of you who've seen them on Question Time. I should say no more. Anyway, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Bell Pottinger, and I'd like to thank our speakers. Dominic Raab is on his way, he's going to be a few minutes late. On my right, we have Skidmore, MP for Kingswood. Next to me, we have the glamorous Elizabeth Truss. On my left, we have the very glamorous Iain Martin. And on my far left, we have the extremely glamorous Mark Littlewood. So without any more ado, you don't want to hear me waffling on, I'd ask Chris to give us a few comments, please. Thank you.
Well, let's cut to the quick. Why we're here and why I'm sure you're here also. We're 5 Conservative MPs from the 2010 intake, an intake of 150 MPs, which makes up over half the Conservative Party. We're here and we've written this book after the coalition because as Conservative MPs we want to fight for David Cameron to be a Conservative Prime Minister leading Conservative government in 2015. Yeah. We do so because we now know, after the Fixed Term Parliament Act has been passed, the date of the general election will take place on the 7th of May 2015. We have 43 months in which to prepare. Now that may seem a long time, and yes, events may overtake us, but David Cameron set up his policy groups in 2006 precisely because he knew, as do all of us, the policies can't be created in a vacuum. They can't be created overnight. They need to be refined, and we need to ensure that our message is crystal clear for the 2015 general election. Now, I don't know who's seen the book, but there's a picture of David Cameron looking like he's waving goodbye on the front. And I have to say, when I first saw before, I thought, Christ, that's the end of my political career. But I very much would like to say, it's David Cameron waving goodbye to the Lib Dems, waving in celebration as he's entering number 10 Downing Street. Because we know that history teaches us coalitions are not built to last. There are some others in our party who might believe that we should fight as coalitionists. But we believe that we need to put a marker down now, that we fight for conservative values, timeless values that we need to apply looking forward to the 21st century. We simply can't look back at a traditional form of conservative that applies to the 20th century. And so this book is very much in the mould of saying, what are the challenges that we face? Because we will face many. In my own specialist interest in health, we have an ageing population, which will mean that we need to find new solutions in order to stop the NHS going bust by 2040. It is not a petty obsession to be thinking about these ideas now. And if I had to say there's one theme of the book that draws all of our ideas together, it is that of responsibility. Now, responsibility is somewhat of a watchword at this very moment in time. We had David Miliband give his Predator producer speech. Oh, sorry. In a marginal seat myself, I thank God it is it. But, responsibility is now the watchword, and we will have a battle over responsibility. Traditionally, responsibility is a conservative value. Ed Miliband is now saying that it is the state's duty to define who is responsible, who is not responsible. I think that's a disastrous policy, but we will have to battle him in order to fight for responsibility. Above all, I believe, and we believe, that it is as individuals that we must ensure that we reward responsible behaviour. And so every single policy in this book follows that similar theme. We could look at polls, we could, as politicians, turn around and say, we shouldn't necessarily follow this policy, we shouldn't follow that policy, simply because the electorate will find that uncomfortable. But as politicians, we also need to have a vision. We also need to set out ideas. We also need to win a narrative and a battle. And this book is staking out that vision. We could go to the polls in 2015 on our record of government, and I'm sure, looking at what has been achieved so far, the electorate will reward us for enacting essentially what are conservative policies. Michael Gove's free schools policy, Ian Duncan Smith's welfare reform bill, capping immigration. We may want to go further in the future, but let us not forget what we have achieved as Conservatives within government. Nevertheless, we must start now to set out a Conservative agenda. The Coalition is here till 2015. We want that Conservative majority government afterwards.
Thank you, Chris. I'll ask Elizabeth to make your comments.
Thank you for the introduction. I would always describe myself as a moderniser. I was first of all a Porter Lister, but that didn't get me very far. And I was on the Cameron campaign team for leadership. And it was so important that as a party, we caught up with modern Britain and understood the concerns of modern Britain. And that's what I believe has changed our fortunes as a party over the last few years and secured David Cameron as Prime Minister of our country. But for 2015, I think we are in a different position from the ones we found ourselves in 2005 and 2006. What 13 years of Labour misrule, of taxation and regulation and meddling has exposed is the fact that we have been losing competitiveness against our rivals, not only our rivals in Europe and the US, but our rivals in China, India, Brazil, and all of the emerging economies. We're now 83rd in the world for regulation. We used to be 4th in 1997. We're 94th for the extent of taxation. If you look at important subjects like maths, where we're 28th, and science, where we're 16th, we're behind not only those in the Far East, but Canada, Germany, France, and even the US. We need a new phase, I believe, as a party, to turbocharge our economy and turbocharge our country. And I think we should describe ourselves as post-modernisers, where our previous challenge was getting the Conservative Party to catch up with Britain. Now we need to get Britain to catch up with the world. And our prescription for this is, first of all, we need to eradicate the excuses culture in this country. Secondly, we need to make individuals responsible, as Chris has outlined. And finally, we need to take on the left in their own territory. There is still a lot of myths floating around from the Blair era, which we need to deal with. And we need to pin the blame fairly and squarely for the dire position our country is in on the previous government and their complete failure to govern effectively. Let me start with the excuses culture. I think in this country we've had a culture which has allowed people to be labelled as geeks. Those in particular who study subjects like science and maths and extol celebrities, and it's no surprise, is it, that the Hugh Grant meeting is better attended than this one at the Institute of Economic Affairs, a profound and deep thinking think tank. It tells you what you need to know about modern Britain today. I think the best countries in the West and the East study rigorous subjects at school, and some of the people in the Labour Party, and I've heard this from Andy Burnham, tell us it's not modern to study the EBAC subjects like sciences, languages. That's not modern, or history of our own country. No, students should be studying ICT, media studies, and other concoctions invented under the Labour government to try and make their league table results look better. But in all countries that are performing, or most countries that are performing better than us in league tables, like Canada and Germany, those subjects are compulsory until 16. It's compulsory to study a language in a state school. It's compulsory to study rigorous sciences in state schools. It's compulsory to study history. And some people say to me, well, Elizabeth, you're a free marketeer. Surely you believe people should make up their own minds. But we're not talking about private schools. We're not talking even about academies. We're talking about state schools under state control. And what we've had is a deliberate policy of diverting students into subjects that aren't any good for their own future. And what we see, and I see this in businesses in Norfolk, is businesses are struggling to recruit engineers and technicians because local students haven't necessarily studied those subjects. And they're importing people from Latvia and Lithuania to do those jobs. So what we propose in our book is a compulsory for state school students to study languages until 16 and history. We also propose an A-level baccalaureate of rigorous subjects so that all students know what are the signposts to get into those top Russell Group universities. At the moment, we're facing social engineering through offer to get the right balance of students. I think we should look at the other way around. We should say, what do we need to do to make sure our state schools are producing pupils that get into those universities on merit? And if I give you an example, 50% of all sixth forms don't offer further mathematics. And in order to study maths and science at a good university, you need to do further mathematics. So 50% of students in this country don't even have the opportunity to do those subjects at university, and I think that's disgraceful. Michael Gove has already gone very far down the line with the English Baccalaureate, with the free schools policy, with the academies policy to change culture in education, and I think we need to go one step further. I think we should also look at countries like Canada and Germany, where if students don't perform each year, then there is a potential that they can be held back. Because one of the comments I've heard from teachers who have come overseas, and I've met Australian teachers and Canadian teachers which have come to work in a school in Thetford, is that our students forget things more easily and are less motivated. They take less responsibility for studying than students in other countries do. And I think having the ability to say it's not just about how clever you are, it's about how hard you work that is so important. And I think we need to change the culture drastically in our schools. I also think we need to free employers from more burdens. I was delighted to hear that unfair dismissal claims will be pushed back for a year. I also think we burden far too many of our employers with things that the government should be dealing with, the child support agency, fines, maternity pay, which the government then claims, which employers then claim back from the government. Let's just, if we want to provide those services, let's just do it direct. Let's not force small employers to fill out forms, which then makes them reluctant to take on people. Chris has talked about the culture shift to individual responsibility. The NHS can't make you healthy if you eat an unhealthy diet and you don't exercise. And we need to put the focus much more on people, because Labour really created a culture where it was all about the rules of the system. If something went wrong, it wasn't any individual who was responsible, it was the process was wrong, or that lessons would be learnt. There were so few reports that actually identified somebody doing something wrong. They muddled up the state sector and the private sector. We say we had PFI contracts where huge risks from the private sector were transferred to the government. What we need is people to take responsibility and accountability for their own actions. So if you are somebody who's led a bank to have to draw on the government to bail you out, you should be held responsible for that. If you're a public servant that's wasted public funds, we should know who you are. If you're a government minister that's made a mistake, you should be held responsible for that. Because I feel that that culture of responsibility, when those at the top fail to take responsibility, it works all the way down the chain. I think the key element, though, in our programme that we outlined for government is that we need to talk about issues that have been hijacked by the left. We need to apply the principles that Conservatives believe in, like meritocracy and the free market, to all aspects of life, and not allow Labour to both define the problem and the solution. Let's take childcare for an example, which we've heard loads about in the press over recent weeks. There's an issue apparently for the Conservative Party. We're not doing as well with women. Childcare is a major issue for families struggling to pay their way. Well, the issue is that under Labour, from 1997, the number of childminders halved. And these are the cheapest and most flexible form of childcare. And the cost of childcare doubled over that period. And what we need, I think, is a policy similar to the free schools policy that we have under our education department, to have a freedom for childcare providers policy as well, so that it's parents that decide where their children, who their children is looked after, rather than Ofsted bureaucrats. Labour introduced a huge number of regulations which is costing working parents a huge amount of money. I also think we need to look at policies like our married couples tax allowance and make sure that that not just benefits single earning families, but also benefits families where both parents go out to work. We need to make sure that our policies are really policies for the modern age, but they are on the basis of meritocracy, individual responsibility and the free market principles that Conservatives believe in. I think the fundamental point about our book is it's an optimistic book. There's a lot of people in Britain that are defeatist. I met Peter Hitchens earlier today, and I certainly found that. A lot of people have written the country off and say that we'll never get out of Europe and we're all doomed to an inevitable decline. I don't think that's true. I think it is possible. We can work harder, we can work smarter, we can educate ourselves better, but we need an attitude change, and we need to be comparing ourselves not just with the other countries in Europe, we need to be comparing ourselves with the rising economies. And we need not to be so arrogant as to say there's nothing we can learn from these other countries. We should be trying to learn what we can and competing with them as best we can. We need to explain the problem to voters. People of Britain are not stupid. They know there are major economic issues. People are fearful. We need to explain the problem and what the solution is, and make sure that our new conservatism is grounded in modern life, and I think that's the way we will win in 2015.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I mentioned to you Grant and glamorous people. You have seen a second ago another glamorous person that came onto the platform here. This is Dominic Raab, who, as you can see, is far better looking than you, Grant, next door.
That's why all the people have started arriving now.
Dominic's the MP for Esher and Walton. Without any further ado, I'll give Dominic the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. And may I just say at the outset, my apologies for arriving late from another event. And I just wanted to open by thanking Mark for organising this debate, and really just say what a fantastic job he's done taking up the helm at the IEA. Really fantastic, with serious political agenda and serious intellectual ideas coming through, which are going to be extremely influential, and certainly I think have been on the authors of this book. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to address foreign policy in Britain and the world. It was 18 years ago today that 2 US Black Hawk helicopters were shot down during a firefight in Somalia, and that precipitated the very abrupt withdrawal of US troops from the humanitarian mission there. And it's Henry Kissinger who looks back on this and says that the administration of George Bush Sr. slipped into a nation-building role, and I quote, oblivious to the implications, and then subsequently reduced US troops from 28,000 to 4,000. And it is that basic failure to reconcile the ends and the means that doomed the mission. And I think, if anything, the period under Tony Blair and George W. Bush amplified this classic tension in foreign policy between our ambitions and our willingness to make the kind of commitments in blood and money that are needed to deliver. In the book, we talk about a whole range of areas, but there is a basic double reality check that we advocate for foreign policy. And it's first of all that the ends must be defined in relation to the means available to achieve them. It ought to be the first thing in any policy, domestic or foreign, but it's certainly important in international relations. And I think the second thing is that the British national interest must be clear and tangible. We're not talking about a hollow realism, a shallow realpolitik, but there ought to be at least some form of self-enlightened national interest driving foreign policy. And it's interesting, if you look back at Tony Blair's seminal speech on foreign policy, it was in 1999 at the Chicago Club, and he said that the national interest is to a significant extent governed by international collaboration. And I think if you look at that phrase, you capture the strategic error in Tony Blair's thinking, because you don't have to accept or buy into this hollow or selfish realpolitik, the kind that led us to turn the other way in Srebrenica or Rwanda. But in a democracy where decisions are accountable to you, the voters, it must be enlightened self-interest driving international cooperation, not the other way around. That must be the basic dynamic for a democratic nation state. What does that mean in practice, fine in principle? Well, let me try and put just a bit of meat on the bones. I think when it comes to military intervention, we've just got to face the consequences of our strategic defence review, not ignore them. And in the short term, I think we've got to say we're going to have to be engaged in wars of necessity, not wars of choice. I don't see any other way around it. Beyond the short term, we need less of the sort of open-ended interventions of the last decade. I'm not saying that we should rule out surgical operations, for example, that would have helped stop the genocide in Rwanda, where of course there were already peacekeepers. But that's different from wholesale nation building from scratch. I'm not saying we should abandon fledgling democracies. In the book we take up some of the ideas of the Oxford development economist, Paul Collier, who's got some interesting ideas about military support for nascent democracies in Asia who are trying to do the right thing. But the aim's not regime change in scenarios like that, and it's not nation building from scratch, as we've gone through in Iraq and Afghanistan. Collier's idea is that you put your muscle, military muscle, behind emerging democracies that are genuinely trying to respect good governance, democracy, human rights, and you protect them when they come under threat, as almost all nascent democracies do in Africa. And your aim here is not, as I said, nation building from scratch, but facilitating the emergence of authentic and genuine African success stories, which can act as a beacon or a model for the rest of the continent. So that's the sort of military side of things. In other areas of foreign policy, we've got to stop signing up to unilateral commitments that we've got no idea how we're going to keep. Let me just give one example on the environmental sphere. The last government signed us up to a unilateral commitment to cut CO2 emissions by 80% by 2050. Now, there's a domestic angle and a foreign policy angle. If the idea is to make Britain lead the way internationally, then it's going to be virtually useless unless we buy in, hook in the other major emitters to that target. If we're serious about decarbonising the economy, and I think there's a strong argument for it, both the environmental side, but also in other respects, energy independence. But if we're going to do that, we advocate a carbon tax at the kind of level that allows nuclear investment in nuclear power, which is realistically the only technology capable of meeting the demands for clean energy from businesses and consumers. And I'm actually delighted that the Lib Dems have, many things maybe say to Chris Hugh, but he's clearly swallowed hard on nuclear policy. I also think we need to go a bit further and scrap the myriad of other tariffs and subsidies that are inflating energy bills and hurt those on the lowest incomes. But above all, and the point I'm trying to make rather than rattle along a sort of policy agenda or menu, is that in foreign policy, our international objectives must be based on some credible domestic capability, not the other way around. And in blunt terms, we've got to end the policy of hit and hope. Last but not least, I think the biggest scandal, everyone says Iraq is the biggest scandal of foreign policy, Tony Blair, I think the biggest scandal over the last 13 or so years is that we didn't get a new free trade deal during the Doha round of WTO talks. And the fact is that the two biggest breaks on that were the US and probably even more so the EU, because they're so protectionist. And if ever we needed a deal on free trade with the global economic crisis that we face, it's now. That would have been a real shot in the arm. And I'm delighted to see William Hague put promotion of free trade at the heart of British foreign policy. It's good for Britain, it's good for the world economy, and it's certainly good for the very poorest countries, which are suffocated and stifled by protectionism. But to do that properly, actually, we need to regain our voice and, at least to some degree, our authority to champion free trade, whether it's in the WTO or in signing bilateral free trade deals in our own name. And given the crisis in the Eurozone and the wider debate, which we're now really frankly is being foisted upon us by President Barroso about the architecture of the EU, I think the time is ripe to renegotiate Britain's relationship. And in this book, we talk about a model of a third choice, if you like, between the status quo and full withdrawal. And my view is that if we're ever going to have a referendum on the EU, and we've got a referendum tripwire in the new EU Act, it ought to include that third choice. Finally, just to wrap up, whilst a lot of the emphasis I'm trying to make is on a foreign policy that reconciles ends with means, I don't think we want the ends to be sacrificed for the means. And I think it's high time we ditched the sort of Western legacy, if you like, derived from Harry Truman's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson. He said of Tito in Yugoslavia, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. Time and time again, I think if you look at it, recent history, history dating back from the post-war era, whether it's Saddam, whether it's Gaddafi, cosseting despots and tyrants has proved not only immoral, but very dangerous in the long term. The son of a bitch, if you like, always seems to come back to bite us. So ladies and gentlemen, we've tried in this book to spell out a foreign policy for the future. We called it rugged internationalism, with echoes of Thatcher and Reagan's rugged individualism. But I think the key thing that I'd just like to finish by emphasising is it's an approach that combines the values of a global good citizen with the realism to rigorously assess the feasibility of British aspirations abroad. Britain should take pride in her foreign policy. Foreign policy should reflect values and responsibilities, but they include responsibility to account for foreign policy to you, the British citizen and taxpayer, who end up funding it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. I'll now hand over to Iain.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to begin by thanking all of the authors for this book. I think there is some very, very good thinking in it. And if you haven't bought a copy of this, I suggest you buy one. £9.99 in all good bookshops. Don't just buy one copy, buy two. Give it to your friends. Ian Dale, who owns Spikeback Publishing, will thank me for that. And I think it's proof that this is the most interesting new Tory intake for decades. Numerically, I'm trying to think what the last election would have been that saw that number of new Tory MPs arrive in the House of Commons. You'd probably have to go back to the 30s, I would have thought. And they are a very interesting bunch. But of course there has to be a but, doesn't there? On the back of this book, this excellent book, it says that at the next election the Conservative Party may well fight for its own mandate, which I just thought might, really? I mean, surely it's a must. Yeah. Surely it's a must. And I think it illustrates a bit of a problem with the coalition and what it's doing to some leading Conservatives, because they're not really sure whether the leadership, which does also, let's remember, hand out ministerial jobs and has its hands on the levers of power, whether that leadership is definitely going to fight for a genuinely Conservative mandate, or whether it might pretend to, but then secretly prefer another coalition because it will save them being held hostage by, as they would say, lunatic right-wingers. I would call them Conservatives. And I just want to pick up on three areas where I think that I stress again, there's some really good thinking in this book, but I just wished it had gone slightly further in certain areas, and that the authors had been prepared to actually really go where their convictions were pointing them. Firstly, on education. It's essentially what's being proposed is the current policy, which is particularly the extension of the Academy's programme, and that combined, I think, is potentially revolutionary, potentially transformative, and then bolting on top of that profit, acceptance of the profit motive within the free schools movement. Fair enough. I buy that. I kind of think, though, that it and even free schools may end up being a bit of a sideshow in this regard. In that the programme will be relatively small, and it's the Academy's programme and its expansion which carries within it the potential smashing of the local education authority network, finally, which something that Conservative governments have sort of hoped to do and tried and failed to do for decades. But there's something missing from the chapter, which is selection. Surely, if the problems facing this country are as great as I think everyone on this panel thinks they are, although Liz is absolutely right, there are great opportunities, we cannot afford to be constrained by the liberal left's dogma of the last 30 or 40 years. Does that mean an immediate return to the 11 plus? No. I would suggest there's the germ of something very interesting what Ken Baker's doing with his technical schools, where kids arrive at 13/14. He's learned from the public school model. That's a good point at which to divide children and invite them to start making choices. If we're going to be genuinely take on the Gove agenda and do something very interesting with it in the years to come, I would suggest that some experimentation with selection, carefully done, is a must. On health, I don't think the book goes nearly far enough. It essentially endorses the Lansley agenda, which I think is insufficient, and I found the fight over monitor, particularly the marketisation, the row last spring post AV referendum, so unbelievably depressing that Steve Hilton and various others in number 10 had identified that monitor was the key test and that modernisers had to win that argument, but it was all given up because the Prime Minister was worried really that the Liberal Democrats were going to run away, which of course they weren't. I mean, they certainly don't want an election. On the economy, I think the tax system doesn't get enough. There's not enough thinking in here been done on the tax system. The tax system is an absolute mess, and I think it is important for Conservatives to acknowledge that in many respects this government is in the process of making it much worse. I think everywhere you go in this conference, people are wearing 50p tax badges. Now, to me, I would love to see the 50p tax band abolished. The band that really, really worries me is the 40p band. And I just find it interesting that the Conservative Party is having not really the kind of row it should be having with itself about the fact that 750,000 extra taxpayers are now in that tax band as a result of adopting the lunatic Lib Dem idea of taking people out of tax entirely. If you believe, as I do, that the tax base should be as broad as possible and people should contribute, you understand that if you take them out of tax entirely, all they will do is vote for parties that suggest that other people pay tax. Rich people, people who earn £20,000, as they would see it. So I would have liked a bit more thinking on tax, and also say something controversial here, something pro Ed Miliband. I think he actually is. I think last week he was onto something. Bear with me. I think it is hugely to the advantage of Conservatives and the business community that Ed Miliband is onto something, but that it's Ed Miliband who's expressing these views and not somebody coherent and charismatic who can sell them to the country. What is that? He has grasped that millions of people in this country who vote for all sorts of parties, and none are deeply concerned about unfairnesses within the tax system, the way in which large parts of, and I speak as a free marketeer, viscerally opposed corporatism, which corporatism is essentially what quite a few free marketeers in this government seem to think is free marketeering, but isn't. I think he's onto something in terms of this pursuit of monopoly and vested interest. Now, there are Conservative answers, and I would cite Roosevelt, the other Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, that great trust buster who took on the giant monopolies, who waged war against monopolistic interests. Now, if free markets are the answer, as I believe and the IEA believes, people are going to have to. It's going to have to be explained to people and demonstrated to people that markets are not a bracket of a small, rich minority who use markets to preserve their influence and prosecute a war against consumers. So I would say that this book has a great deal of very interesting stuff in it. It also, within the conclusion, identifies one of the key failings of the Tory modernisation programme, which is the obsession with focus group politics. Don't get me wrong, I think that it is important that modern political parties use all the tools available to test their messages and find out what the public are thinking and all the rest of it. However, it did, post-92, the victory of Clinton, Labour's defeat in that same year, it did create a postmodern view of politics where you essentially find out roughly where the public are and try and get as close to it as possible, find a charismatic leader, get him to talk about change. Bingo, that equals, Conservative majority of 100. Well, it didn't, did it? So the public have rumbled this, and the conclusion in this book absolutely nails that. And I think the key is really, and something that Tory modernisers didn't really understand, is that you have to start from what you believe. You have to start with your worldview and your analysis of what the country needs. You then work out from that, and you have to make some compromises, and you have to concede some things. Of course you have to. That's politics throughout the ages. But you can't begin with focus group politics. So I would say well done to the authors. I would say buy this book, but I would just encourage them all and their fellow members of the 2010 intake to be even bolder. Thank you.
Thanks, Iain. Mark, please.
Kevin, thank you. I always thought it was a good choice to go last, because then you've got lots of people to respond to. The problem is everything's been said. So I think I can keep my comments pretty brief. Like Iain, I welcome the book as well, and I think that there is also something very significant about the new intake of Conservative MPs, where an awful lot, I understand, amongst members of the Conservative Party is being discussed about the fact that there are only 307 Conservatives, whereas I imagine you all wanted 325 or more. But the new intake is not just sizable, it's of a miraculous quality. And I think that bodes quite well, not just for the prospects of the Conservative Party in communicating its message, but crucially, Liz, Dominic, Chris, Kwasi and Sajid have contributed to this book. The new group that Liz has set up to promote free enterprise in the Conservative Party are interested in ideas. And I think actually I'm at one with Iain on this. Actually winning the battle of ideas is the way of getting a sensible government. That's not to say that you should never focus group anything or you should never look at the polls, but that has to be the starting point. So a book called After the Coalition, which I commend you to read, and I think that it's fair to say that this is a starting point in what new Conservative MPs are thinking. That none of the authors claim that this is a fully costed programme for government. It's a range of ideas and analysis. Is, I suppose, to look at the coalition record to date. This is about what should post-date the coalition. And I had mixed feelings about the coalition's record to date. I mean, in essence, the Conservative Party, and indeed the Liberal Democrats, turned up in May last year at the scene of a road accident. It was an absolute car smash, the state of the economy. And pretty much, I would say that George Osborne as Chancellor and the government as a whole have successfully applied a tourniquet at the scene of that road accident. The United Kingdom's AAA rating seems intact. The deficit is slowly but surely being got under control. And the coalition is embarking on a programme of fiscal consolidation. That is to be, I think, applauded, or at least applauded with one hand. It is important, however, to point out really, despite the sound and fury we often get about this, that the fiscal consolidation programme doesn't amount to a whole hill of beans. You would have thought, I think by reading a lot of the newspapers or watching television, that there is some holocaust of public spending happening. Even if the government hits its targets, public spending will reduce by 0.7% per annum in real terms between now and the general election. That is to say that for every pound that was being spent by Ed Balls and Gordon Brown as they left office, the coalition's intention is to spend 97p by the time the next general election is held. Now, in fairness, this will be, if they are successful, the only government in my lifetime to cut government expenditure, the only one. But these are relatively modest cuts in expenditure, so I think needs to be seen in the context of applying bandages at the scene of the accident. And that is just about working. What's interesting about this book, and I think about the new intake Conservative members of Parliament, is what would phase 2 look like? Now, phase 2 might be a majority Conservative government after the next election. It might actually be addressing some of the ideas in this book before the next election. But what would it look like? And latterly, of course, the George Osborne in particular, but across the board, the word's clearly gone out. Everybody has to be talking about the growth agenda. Now, the IEA is interested in ideas and economics, not particularly the day-to-day political battles. But if I could just veer into the day-to-day political battles, I think that the fact of the matter is this, that the electoral prospects for the Conservative Party at the next election are going to be wedded entirely, really, to the level of GDP growth that occurs between now and 2015. Other factors could kick in, other things could go well or badly, but pretty much the higher the level of GDP growth between now and 2015, the better the prospect the Conservative Party has of being re-elected. So if it doesn't put all of its eggs in that basket, it should be putting a large number of them in that basket. And I therefore worry a little, because although the Chancellor of the Exchequer said yesterday, nobody should tell me that we are not focusing on growth. And although I agree with Iain to some considerable degree that the 50p rate debate is becoming rather totemic rather than being actually a monumentally significant economic policy either way, we now seem to be in a world in which virtually everybody, I include the Institute for Fiscal Studies in this regard, not known as ranting free marketeers, accepts that the 50p tax rate almost certainly raises no money and indeed may actually lose the Exchequer revenue. Yet, for political reasons, it's not going to be abandoned. Well, you've got to decide what you care about, the political reasons or the economy. It's worth saying as a side issue to that, I think the particular problem, and I agree with Iain on the 40p rate, is actually the marginal rate of tax that people face between £100,000 and £140,000 a year. The rate of money you lose from a pay rise is now 62%. There is no point, if you're earning about 100k, seeking to earn more, really. You're losing nearly 2/3 of it. The minimum wage has been increased by the government just this weekend to £6.08. Is that a serious way of tackling the 1 million 16 to 24-year-olds who are out of employment? Red tape and regulation. Every government, and it doesn't matter what colour it is, promises to solve this issue. The incoming coalition government promised a bit more than that. I don't know if you remember when Nick Clegg was made Deputy Prime Minister, he promised a great repeal bill, which would be, he said, the greatest recalibration of the relationship between the individual and the state since 1832. After a few weeks, he pretty much gave up and passed most of it on to Theresa May. What has emerged has not even been the most substantial recalibration of the relationship between the individual and the state this year. That is a lamentable failure in terms of deregulation. Despite the coalition stemming the tide to some degree with its one-in, one-out rule, regulation under this government, not counting anything that has come from Brussels, has increased. The number of Whitehall rules and regulations and the burden on business has increased. It has increased at a lower rate than it was increasing under the last administration, but has still increased. And Iain made mention of the diabolical mess of the taxation system. The 50p rate is one small issue within this. We now have a tax code which is the longest in the world. The tax rules in this country are the longest and the most complex on the planet. About twice the length of France's tax code. About 5 times the length of the complete works of Shakespeare. That is the number of words involved in simply complying with the law. On the IEA's research and estimates, British business now spends £20 billion a year merely complying with tax laws, working out what they have to hand over. Not a penny of that is going to the government. That's all going to tax accountants. And I think addressing that supply-side reform, which I know all of our 3 Conservative MPs on this panel are interested in, is going to be a crucial part of phase 2. And also addressing, frankly, the size and scope of the state. We've seen, almost by stealth, the proportion of GDP spent by the state in this country eke up from about 38% to now more than 50%. To put that in context, the most successful economies on the planet, if you were to look at, say, the Singapores or the Hong Kongs, spend around 20 to 25% of their GDP in the public sector. On some estimates, communist China spends a mere 17% of its GDP in the public sector. The former Soviet Union is reckoned to have spent about 70% of its GDP in the public sector. That's to say that the United Kingdom has now edged itself closer to the former Soviet Union in terms of GDP spent by the state than it is to Hong Kong, Singapore and the other successful areas of the world. Debt was clearly the issue that drove the coalition and the key issue that it's addressed. And I think there are a lot of ideas in this book, not just on the economy. Dominic spoke very eloquently on foreign affairs and a different change there, but that start to preempt some of the important controversial issues that, if you only look at the focus groups, won't be dealt with. And I think the National Health Service will be the next of those. I understand that 93% of people in Britain love the National Health Service if you poll anybody, but the fact that by 2030 spending will double on healthcare if we keep the present model is not sustainable. And I hope that with regard to the NHS, rather than at some point a new government being elected and saying, well, we've woken up this morning and looked at the numbers and we now need to do something about it, that the contributors to this book and the wider network of Conservative MPs can start actually looking into possible solutions there. Anyway, I haven't struck a particularly optimistic note, I've struck a pessimistic note. Liz was quite right when she said we need to be optimistic. Sometimes, although I can barely remember them, it feels a bit like being back in the 1970s. There's financial problems, there's wars with the trade unions, and so on and so forth. I don't want to overstretch that parallel, because in 1970 a new Conservative government was elected that promised to change a lot of things. By the end of its term there was an energy crisis and the election was called on who runs Britain, and the Labour Party won it and nearly bankrupted the country. So I don't want to stretch that parallel too far. But I think it is important to be optimistic. In the mid-1970s, my predecessor, Ralph Harris, who ran the IEA, said, cheer up, things can only get worse. What he meant by that was actually you do sometimes need to stare over the edge of the cliff before you rediscover what you need to do to put your economy back together. But to be of a slightly more optimistic note, Ronald Reagan said in the 1960s, when the American economy was facing a large number of problems, and it was put to him that there were no easy solutions. And he said, no, you're right, there are no easy solutions, but there are simple solutions. And I thought that was a rather profound observation, because I think there are some pretty simple solutions in the United Kingdom, and it's getting down tax, changing our public services to make them more responsive to the people who use them, and beginning to reduce the role of the state and encouraging free enterprise and entrepreneurialism rather than strangling it. And I actually think that this book and those who've written it have made a substantial contribution to starting to move the public debate in that area and in that direction. So I thank them for it. Thank you for your time.
I'm now going to throw the questions over to the floor. There's a roving mic. Please have to keep your questions short, and also please have the courtesy to the panel members and explain where briefly your name, where you're from. First question over there.
Hi, my name's Felix. I work at the Trade Policy Research Centre. I think one of the things that's been lacking from the actual spending review is that although there have been spending cuts made, there haven't been areas of government activity that have actually been entirely eliminated. And what we've seen actually is broadly salami slicing in spending, rather than actually looking at what functions the state should perform and those which we actually think it should not. So I would like to ask the MPs on the panel what functions of government or the state that they perform now that they would like to see not done by government altogether, and what role do they sort of see for business, enterprise, or third sector, big society sort of stuff, filling that gap which the state fills at the moment?
The one obvious thing that just sprung to mind was the Quango bill that's going through, because I've got the great privilege to sit on the bill committee and just going line by line through all these wretched Quangos. So there's one good example there. The Equality and Human Rights Commission gets a lot of stick, and rightly so. We're paring down its functions. We're not abolishing it. But look, there's a case. Well, wait to hear the rest of the answer. There's a strong case for anti-discrimination law in this country. I think we would all agree with that. But what it's going to, I hope, cut back is this creeping social engineering and this creeping shift. And there's a Westminster consensus which is creeping in the direction of more positive discrimination. I was delighted to see the coalition rule out gender quotas in the boardroom. But so if you ask me what the state should be doing, okay, sure, it's got a role in regulating discrimination in terms of anti-discrimination, but it certainly shouldn't be going into positive discrimination and social engineering.
I'd just like to pick up what Mark raised about the NHS in relation to your question, because we do have this demographic shift. There will be an ageing population. The number of 85-year-olds is going to double by 2030. It's estimated that spending on healthcare will have to rise to around £230 billion, double what we're spending at the moment. Now we have a debate to be had here. Do we say that we put 2p on income tax and say that actually it's the state's responsibility to look after everyone cradle to grave, or do we look afresh and come to a new consensus that people's healthcare is also their own responsibility? As Liz says, the NHS can't keep you healthy if individuals themselves aren't able to keep themselves healthy, to take exercise. And that is a controversial statement to make. But when we look at centre-left governments, social democracies in Europe, take places like the Netherlands, for instance, who instituted, after a 25-year debate, after the DECA report, a compulsory health insurance system, where you've got a risk-pooling mechanism where the most vulnerable, those people with genetic disorders, are then competed over by an insurance scheme, and the state has a role in almost underwriting the vulnerable. That is something I believe that we need to look at, because, quite simply, we ain't going to pay, by 2050, £230 billion from the Treasury. There is a huge problem. When we look at the NHS internationally, we spend roughly around about 8 to 9% of our GDP on healthcare. The NHS does a great job on that money, but it's chronically underfunded. Most other Western democracies spend around 13%, and as a result have better prevention, more checks, more doctors, more MRI scanners. We do need to be in a situation eventually, and this is not necessarily a debate to be had for the next election. We've got the ideas men on the left, and we are politicians on the right here. And as somebody who won my seat off Labour, it was a 7,000 Labour majority, it's now a 2,000 Conservative majority. One of the reasons why I think we need to look at why the Conservative Party didn't achieve a majority, and why and I know it's hard to say this, we lost the 2010 general election, is because Labour scared the shit out of my constituents in margin areas like Kingswood, saying that we were going to take a winter fuel allowance, that we were going to close down the NHS. And we cannot take that gamble immediately of basically saying ideas are the only things in the room. There is a balance to be struck by looking at public service reform and recognising that though we may want to get from A to B, we can't get to B overnight. We can't get there. So we need to win the argument, and we win the argument by creating a narrative. And that's why we've written this book, is to begin to construct that narrative, to be able to paint a picture. Constituents don't look at graphs, don't look at tables, they don't read IEA publications, much as I would like them to do so. What they do know is how the state applies to their own lives and how it doesn't apply to their own lives. What they do recognise is where the state's getting in the way. What they do recognise is where they're paying tax. They would prefer that to be in their back pocket rather than have some useless Whitehall bureaucrat spending it on their behalf. We need to paint those pictures. We can start with the complicated policy analysis, but by 2015 it needs to boil down to 3 sentences on the door, and that's the journey that we need to begin.
Elizabeth.
Thank you. In terms of which Whitehall areas we should look at, I mean, I think there are a lot of candidates, and I think under Labour there was an explosion of government departments, so new departments were created like DEC, like the Ministry of Justice and the Home Office are now separate departments. I think we should look at amalgamating those back. I sit on the Justice Committee. It's a complete waste of money, having 2 separate departments taking up 2 huge buildings in central London, when actually the police and probation service should be working together, and it's being prevented by that split. So At the beginning of the government, I know the Prime Minister wasn't keen to rearrange the deck chairs in Whitehall, but I do think the government machine itself is a massive issue that we need to address, and we need to address the size of that, because until you improve the way the levers operate, it's difficult to reform the rest of the public services. So I think that's a big issue. In terms of what the state shouldn't be involved in, my biggest go at the moment is at Network Rail. And I think these organisations that exist in a twilight zone between the private and public sector, where they're accountable to nobody, are some of the worst in our country. I would like to see, certainly on lines like the ones in Norfolk, a more regionalised railway system, reintegrating the track and train, so that we can have proper competitive businesses, because at the moment we're just throwing money into Network Rail, which is an incredibly inefficient organisation. I also think the state should withdraw from direct intervention in energy markets. We should be saying, you know, if there is an issue with carbon, let's set a floor price, as Dominic suggests, and see which technology is the most effective. To my mind, that is nuclear technology. Let's just get on with it.
Yeah.
Let's not have masses of micro subsidies on other forms of energy, which ends up creating problems and means that the state is far too involved in the precise direction of policy. It should be up to the private sector to innovate on that. But the other thing is just mission creep, and what's happened in things like childcare, which I mentioned, because the regulations are so complex, it's state children's centres that have benefited at the expense of private nurseries. So you see a huge shift in the state providing more and more of something, and I think the state should be a provider of last resort in those circumstances rather than the preferred provider, which it has been under the way. I couldn't resist replying to Iain's point on selection, I'm afraid, because we don't rule out further selection in the book. Actually, we're slightly ambiguous on that point, because I just think the British education debate has been dominated by this idea that the pupils are the problem. So let's have a different mix of pupils in the school, is what people on the left say. So they have these ridiculous bandings where they try and decide the ability in advance and stick them together, or have a lottery. And the right has traditionally argued for a return to the grammar school system. You know, I think the issue is the schools aren't good enough, not the students aren't good enough. And I think there's an over-focus on the natural ability of students rather than motivating students to work hard at school. And if you look at the most successful countries, they're ones where the students take responsibility for their own learning. They go home, they study a textbook in the evening, and they decide how they're going to work. So I'm not against the idea of schools selecting by ability. I think it's right. But I think if we do things in the wrong order, if we don't reform the schools to be responsive to what their customers want, but instead we just introduce selection like we had it before, we're just going to get a whole bunch of sink schools. So I'm not against it in principle, but I think from where we are now, we need to make sure the schools are good enough and not overly focus on the pupils they're getting into the schools.
But you'll notice that I didn't advocate introducing a replica of the system that existed before. I suggested some room for experimentation on selection. I tell you what.
Well, I probably agree with you. And there's a school. There's an example of a school that I know of, which actually has a grammar section within the school. So you've got 3 buildings, there's flexibility between those 3 buildings, but you've got, if you like, a mini grammar school. And I think we can look at new ideas like that as ways of building really good schools. But I think, you know, saying that it's really about the students rather than about the quality of teaching and what subjects we're teaching in the school is the wrong focus of the debate at the moment.
I think you have to be bolder. If we're going to end what is essentially a giant upper middle class racket and conspiracy against the poor in this country, which has landed with absolutely shocking education. And I suppose the thing that gets my goat about it most really is having to listen to speeches by Nick Clegg, who went to Westminster, lecture people like me who went to comprehensive schools about the iniquities of selection.
Can I just come back one more on that? Yeah, sorry. I too went to a comprehensive school, so I'm not going to have Iain out comprehensive me. Out comprehensive me on this issue. But if you look, it's quite interesting looking at areas of the country where there are grammar schools. And I think in the, you know, my grandfather went to a grammar school from Driffield, and he was the first to go to university from that school, and I think there was a genuine meritocracy. I think now, in some areas with grammar schools, middle class parents are training their children up to pass the entrance exams, and I know that's true in areas of Yorkshire, I know it's true in areas of London. So the idea that that's
because there's a shortage of supply, so why not increase the supply?
Well, I agree with increasing the supply, but the point I'm making is that we're in a different, we're in perhaps a less innocent world where we've had years and years of people moving into catchment areas where there are decent schools. And the question is which pit you go for first.
Sorry, Mark.
Chris made the very fair point that the three people on Kevin's right are need to be involved in real politique and what pragmatic decisions can be made at any given time. Of course, they have to be. And I suppose Ian and my jobs are to be permanently disappointed with their efforts, however they will. But I do want to go back to Felix.
Very nice about you, Mark.
But I do want to tackle Felix's point on salami slicing, because this is an important one, and I think actually a big weakness in the comprehensive spending review. And it goes to Liz's point of mission creep. The experience from other countries in the world who have had a successful deficit reduction programme or spending cuts programme that's stuck, that's worked, is that you don't do what Danny Alexander did, which is write round to 100% of departments asking how they can cut 10% of costs. You write round to 10% of departments and tell them that they are closing down. You just get rid of whole programmes and you decide what they are. It's the same cut in government expenditure either way. You can either get each department to source cheaper paper clips and make sure they use the photocopier more efficiently, or you decide that there are certain areas of government activity that you are going to shut down. And in Canada in particular, that was the way round it was placed. It was not squeezing out efficiency savings. Look, everyone's in favour of efficiency savings, but if you're serious about fiscal consolidation, if you're serious about cutting back the size of the state, that's not the way you can do it. So I've got two candidates. The first is the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills should be shut. If there are three things that you could list that the government is appalling at, they are business, innovation and skills. So to have a Department for Business, Innovation and Skills seems to me can be completely preposterous. And you may well recollect, of course, that the Liberal Democrats were all in favour of closing this department down when it was called the DTI. Now Vince Cable's in charge of it, they seem a bit less so. And the other department I'd shut down would be the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. You might need a department for culture and media in Stalin's Russia. I'm not sure you really need one in the United Kingdom. If there are any residual functions there, they should be wrapped up in the Home Office. I would shut those down, not trim them back.
I'm Deputy Leader of the Conservative Group in Harrow Council. Until we lost the election last year, I was in charge of adult social care, and this seems to be an area where positive things are happening, in that the whole country is, in local government, is voucherising, sort of personalising social care, giving the power expenditure and the construction of care plans to the users themselves, such that something like 30% of the council's revenue spend will be passed out of the door to the users themselves, which seems a really good first step to actually saying things like insurance to take over that, people making their own contributions to that. It gives them that power. Going to the point about the NHS, so much of healthcare is actually sort of low-level sort of social care. It could be managed. Diabetes, for instance, is really a sort of a social care issue, and we can basically move the NHS budget in large part into this kind of sort of personal budget approach, sort of voucher. And this is something that's going on positively, quietly, but which gives us a means by which we can hang further reforms on.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, no, the point you raise is a very fascinating one that we take up in the book, particularly around the element of care and the NHS, partly because the NHS has been focused around treatment rather than care. but actually, if you focus on care, you will bring down incidentally costs. One of the problems we have with the NHS is that we don't have the data to show who's actually using the NHS. We roughly know that every 36 hours, 3 million people walk through the NHS door in some form. But what we don't know is, out of those 3 million people, who are the ones who are constantly using the NHS? You know, the focus is on the supply side of the NHS, which is fine, we've got a lot to do there. But on the demand side, how can we bring demand down? We know that it's going to increase with an ageing population, but one of the things we look at is what's happened in the States, and there's something called the Camden Coalition. Camden's a very poor city in Chicago, and a gentleman called Jeff Brenner was able to use data to create health maps in the same way that we have CompStat crime maps, and he was able to show that out of 20% of the population there were spending 90% of healthcare costs, and 1% of the population were spending 30% of all healthcare costs. And I vouch today that if we looked at the NHS, it would be exactly the same situation. But what we're not able to do, because the NHS, with its universal principle, just ignores the fact that there are some people who are super users, and if we tackled them, then we would bring costs down within the NHS and make it a far more manageable service. Just very quickly on social care, the DILNOT Commission has now reported we're going to obviously have a white paper next year. DILNOT provides a foot in the door to having insurance mechanisms. And this may be, again, I talk from the journey from A to B, we do need to stop the left from just attacking us and basically being sort of cold-hearted Tories, which we're not. You know, we fought to basically show that we protect and we value the NHS. But insurance mechanisms will ensure that the NHS can continue and have more cash inside of it. But with DILNOT, we need to make sure that actually when people want to insure themselves, that we show that that's personal responsibility, and that is the way forward, that people got to take responsibility not only for their old age but for their health.
Thank you. Gentleman here.
Andrew Lillico, Hartsmead. If and when there's another serious recession between now and the next general election, or if we just have stagnant growth and the government is forced to do more of the same, as George Osborne is reported as saying he would do under those circumstances in terms of further spending cuts, will that strengthen the case for the kinds of ideas which you proposed, or will they be turned into the kind of white elephants that 2005-6 discussions of moving from econocentric to sociocentric conservatism have been rendered by events subsequently?
Well, I think that I think the challenge presented to us as a party and us as a government isn't at the moment by the opposition, it's by the global economy. And that clearly is the challenge. And my view is that the competitiveness position is very, very worrying. And a lot of those issues won't be solved overnight. So sorting out the education system is not something that will deliver for 10 or 20 years, realistically. Likewise, what some of the welfare issues we face are long term. We need to have an impetus for deregulation anyway. I think the crisis in the Eurozone does present an opportunity to repatriate powers, and that's what we argue in the book, and that's what we need to be seen to be doing. I mean, are we discussing with government ministers about the kinds of deregulation we want to see? Yes, all the time. But the issue is, it's such a, there's an issue in the Southwest Norfolk constituency of the Natural Habitats Directive and the way that's applied in an incredibly onerous way by Natural England, which it turns out they're just doing to cover their backs so they don't face any risk about the way they've implemented. It's not implemented like that in any other countries in Europe. So those battles go on, and people are putting the pressure. But I mean, I think it's going to, the truth is going to out about the position we're in, but I don't think the public are fully aware of the competitiveness position we find ourselves in, and I think it's part of our responsibility to explain that and elucidate that.
Mark? I don't know the answer to Andrew's question about what the response would be if there's a double-dip recession. I don't know. And I don't want to sound flippant about it by saying that we shouldn't waste a good crisis. That makes it sound flippant. It would be very bad news if there's a terrible downturn in Europe. But those with a free market disposition completely failed to seize the debate and the agenda in about 2008, in my view, with disastrous consequences, which has now brought capitalism and freedom into disrepute in the public domain. So the myth that the problem that caused all of this was, you know, a handful of bankers playing in the casinos is now accepted wisdom. So whatever happens, I think that those who believe that capitalism is the route to the best possible society that human beings can live in and that free markets are good, we need to stand guard to seize the agenda and to explain what has occurred, not retreat back into our shells and apologise for it.
Yeah. But I think that partly, I think that's absolutely spot on. But I think that has had terrible consequences for the Conservative Party and for the country, in that it leads to yesterday and a speech which was widely hailed as very good by the sort of people who used to write pieces on our Chancellor's speeches saying that Gordon Brown's speeches were very good. It was a speech which contained some really troubling, dangerous ideas around this credit easing stuff, which I don't think the Treasury even understands it, even understands what it's proposing. And is this government really in the business of socialising lending? I suppose, as Terry Smith, a noted authority, put it, if you think that banks are bad at organising lending to business, just wait until you see the government having it. And I think that can be directly traced back to what Mark was talking about, and that comes from Conservatives in government reacting in an essentially pragmatic, panicky, tactical way, rather than starting from first principles. What about inflation, which hardly ever gets a look in? I mean, inflation is sort of rattling along at 4 or 5%. Wages are flatlining. Taxes are going up. Then government ministers scratch their heads and say, "There seems to be a demand problem here somewhere in the economy." But not having started from first principles, I think they then end up coming up with botched answers. I think it's deeply troubling.
Thanks, Dominic. Sorry.
I think there's a much bigger underlying problem. We tend to treat the Eurozone crisis and the problems in the US as financial issues, debt issues, whereas actually there's an underlying competitiveness issue, which is why no one in the West seems able to pay off their debts. The historian Niall Ferguson has talked about this a lot. That he says that the West has almost lost faith in the very competitive ideals that made it great. I think there's a strong feeling about that. His book on civilization is well worth reading about this. What are we going to do about it? I mean, actually, take Ian's point about the pitch about how bold we were. Although actually, if you read the introduction, it's very clear we're fighting for a Conservative majority at the next election. But actually, in various areas, we've been pretty brave on taxes. We advocate scrapping 50p, further cuts in business taxes, not solely because we're in some corporatist agenda, but because the unemployed are the people that I'm most worried about, and cutting business taxes will help them most. Merger of national insurance and income tax. So there's quite a lot on cutting taxes and a clear commitment to lowering the overall level of taxation in this country. We want renegotiation of our relationship with Europe. We want stronger trade liberalisation in the WTO. We can rattle off all these things we want, but I think there's a broader thing here. At a domestic level, if we don't get to grips with this, we're going to have the big problem in the 21st century is going to be the brain drain. So unless we can retain, reward, and recognise talent, we'll just lose it. Because the opportunities to work abroad and to go elsewhere where the rewards are greater are going to drain all the talent away. And I think the big political challenge, and Ian's touched on it, and actually Ian and Chris have touched on it in different ways, the real challenge is we've got this grip of the politics of envy in this country, and until we get onto the politics of aspiration, I don't think we'll get any of this achieved.
Yeah, that's right.
I think politics of aspiration is a great segue to my question.
Could you explain who you are?
Sorry, my name's Martin Tett. I'm leader of Buckinghamshire County Council, where we still, by the way, have grammar schools. But moving on from that, my parents came from a very large council estate in North London. Given that social mobility is pretty well ground to halt in the last 13 years, what does the panel propose to actually re-kickstart social mobility? Or do they agree with Nick Clegg, it's basically about banning interns?
Well, I certainly think it's nothing to do with banning interns, and I think that was a, that was a tail wagging the dog situation. I mean, I think it's a free market, and if people want to work and gain experience, then that's good news, and it was utterly ridiculous. And actually, that was one thing the Prime Minister rejected. The critical point is education. I think that's the area where the state has the biggest power to intervene, because we have a state-controlled education system, a state-controlled national curriculum, which just hasn't delivered for a period of years and has actually got worse. There are lots of positive changes, like abolishing modular exams, so the exams are going to be the end of courses, making the curriculum much more rigorous in various subjects. And I think that we need to provide, however you do it, a route through the system for bright students from all backgrounds to excel, and that route just isn't there. At the moment, there are confused messages. So the league tables actually encourage schools to push students into the wrong subjects that aren't going to be any good for their future careers. Yeah. And I think, the social mobility fell under Labour, and we need to pin that to them. And organisations they invented, like Offer, the university regulator, the number of state school pupils going to Oxford and Cambridge has gone down since that body was put into existence. So, why is it continuing? Why hasn't it been repurposed and retasked with doing something different? And I think that it's really back to Dominic's point, which is so right about the politics of envy versus the politics of aspiration. And I feel that we will really appeal to people who want to get a step on the ladder by being much more aspirational, rather than attacking people in well-off positions. I think the Liberal Democrats are shooting themselves in the foot on this one.
But I think we're coming to the end of or possibly past the end of a golden era, post the 44 Acts, to the kids who benefited from that, of extraordinary social mobility in civil service, in business. These men and women are now retiring, and many are past retirement age. And I don't think you can do it without being brutally realistic about it. The only answer is to find a way for kids from poor and modest backgrounds to get to elite schools. They have not just education that's a bit better than that provided under New Labour, but elite education. You can only really do that by introducing, by extending a measure of selection. That doesn't mean, as I indicated earlier, you return to what existed before. But I would encourage people to go and look at what Ken Baker's doing with the technical schools, which is an extraordinarily exciting development. And I think he could open 50, 100 tomorrow if the government would fully back it. So I think you need to develop two strands of this at the same time, dramatically improved. So general education, dramatically improved, technical education, probably selecting at 13/14, and proper elite schools, encouraging grammar schools and grade schools in the independent sector to set up selective academies inside some of the poorest parts of Britain. I think in the wake of the riots, the Prime Minister could have done it in Tottenham and other places. I think he could have got away with just about anything. He could have said, I'm sorry, we're going to have to do something much bolder than we've previously been prepared to do.
The housing estate that your parents grew up on, I imagine, if you looked at the number of people working on the housing estate, it might have been 1 in 2, 1 in 3 families. The research shows now the housing estates of today, that's slipped down to 1 in 9. The problem of social mobility isn't just that education is a panacea that will solve all ills. We have a problem. Britain isn't broken, but we have wells of deprivation in this country that has got far worse. And how do we solve that? I mean, today we've heard at conference about extending the right to buy principle. One of the things we look at the book is actually a right to own, to go far further, in order to actually allow people to have the independence to own their own property, that freedom, and actually to create a model where the state can say, actually, if you work hard enough, if you behave well enough, you will have the right to own your council property, your social housing units. And we do that by actually saying that if someone has been there for a certain amount of time, they've got the right to go to the estate agent and sell it, retain 30% of their equity stake, to go off and take that 30% and now put it in a shared ownership scheme. There are ways in which I think housing has been underrated as a vehicle through which actually you can generate social mobility and in turn aspiration. That's just one key idea of the book I thought I'd also raise.
I don't have a silver bullet in terms of solving the social mobility problem, which is clearly a problem. But we can say for certain one bullet that we don't want to fire, and that is big government spending and big government programmes. Because that was tried and tested to destruction over the past 10 or 15 years. And what I think we need to guard against, well, not only guard against, but actually argue against, is the idea that one more heave or giving this particular quango or government project a slightly different remit will solve it. The amount of money in nominal terms government spending basically doubled between 1997 and 2010 that was spent on this, the number of projects that were invested in it, just colossal, to an utterly bewildering lack of effect. So I don't have a solution, but I at least, I think, can warn against a false god.
Okay, on that positive note, I'm sure Mr. Gaddafi would agree, but there we are. Can I just thank everybody for coming? We do have copies of the book at the back, and can I thank our panel, and thank you very much.